in turn. But if that what they receive from Russia is what they actually need at the moment, either technological know-how, if we think about re-entry technology of ICBMs, if this is what they actually get, I think they are even more invested to continue.
오늘은 독일과 유럽의 시선에서 북한 문제를 살펴봅니다. 독일을 비롯해 유럽연합은 지난 수십 년간 북한의 비판적 관여를 유지해왔습니다. 북한과의 대화를 놓지 않고 경제는 물론 지식과 산업 영역의 지원을 경주해왔습니다. 그러나 김정은 집권 이후 북한의 핵능력이 강화됨에 따라 국제적으로 대북제재가 강화되기 시작합니다. 유럽 역시 이 대북제재에 적극적으로 참여하면서 유럽과 북한 관계에는 균열이 나타나기 시작했습니다. 북한의 전통적인 핵심 외교 거점이었던 베를린의 북한 대사관이 대북제재 이후 상당수 인원이 철수한 채 흉물로 남아있는 장면은 유럽과 북한의 관계를 상징합니다. 2020년 코로나 팬데믹으로 스스로 북한이 국경을 봉쇄한 이래 2022년 러시아-우크라이나 전쟁에 직접적으로 참여하면서 북한은 더 이상 유럽의 대화와 관여의 대상이 아닌 직접적인 안보 위협 세력으로 변모하기 시작합니다. 독일의 Institute for International and Security Affairs, 즉 독일 국제안보연구소의 에릭 볼 바흐 박사는 최근 방위 산업을 재편성하며 재무장하고 있는 독일과 유럽 지역의 대북한 인식을 설명합니다.
Today we invited the Dr. Erik Balbach from the Stiftung und Politik, the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Yeah, we will listen to his briefing on the German perspective on North Korea. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I want to say a few words about my personal motivation on studying Korean Peninsula affairs. This started between 25 years ago now, and my motivation in getting into especially also North Korean affairs was basically that 25 years ago, when you still had to consult libraries for your research, primarily there was hardly any quality material which I could find, especially in Europe. So it started with this academic fascination of North Korea being not well understood. And then my research after 12 years working for the Institute of Korean Studies at Freie University Berlin, my research was always very policy oriented. So I moved to the German Institute for International and Security Affairs 7 years ago, where I serve as a Korea Foundation Fellow. So my part of my work then was also in participating in informal dialogues involving high-ranking officials from North Korea, South Korea, and the US, which were previously held in Europe in a couple of cities. So this gave me an additional motivation to keep going with Korean Peninsula affairs, especially as we moved more to the security field of things in Europe as well. So how does Germany engage with North Korea? I want to make the first point, and I think this is very important to understand. If we talk about Germany-North Korea relations, we always have to think about EU-North Korea relations as well, because German foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula, both North and South Korea, is of course always embedded in the broader relations of the EU. with both North and South Korea. So let me first focus on the bilateral track, meaning the immediate bilateral relations between Germany and North Korea. And of course, historically, this started with the GDR's relations to North Korea in Cold War times, which were comparatively close, and we can still see signs of this relationship in North Korea actually today, if we look at issues like the reconstruction of the North Korean town Hamhung, which was done by East Germany. Of course, a particular point in time was the German reunification, and after German reunification, West Germany and East Germany, after they were reunified, Germany started its relationship with North Korea basically in 2001 when, or at least officially, when diplomatic relations were established. But as early as the 1990s, Germany was involved in North Korea, especially through humanitarian assistance initiatives. The broader EU, and I will come back to this in a second, of course, was also active during that time. The issue was that after the so-called second nuclear crisis emerged, Germany and the EU mostly lent political support then to the six-party talk process, while sanctions became an ever more important of the broader political strategy vis-à-vis North Korea. And Germany was one of the driving forces of autonomous EU sanctions against North Korea. A particular important moment then was Germany's publication of the Indo-Pacific strategy in 2020, which showed that Germany was eager to diversify its relationship in the region and play a more active role in the broader Indo-Pacific. Again, we have to see the German policies on the broader Indo-Pacific also in the context of the EU, since Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy was always meant to be a complementary part of a broader EU strategy on the region. So this is why it's very important to understand this distinction, and we will surely come back to the bilateral angle on this as well. If we talk about the broader EU relations on North Korea, we see distinct development phases. In the 1990s, the EU was highly active. We call this period active engagement usually. This was when the EU started not only to provide humanitarian assistance to North Korea, but importantly also got involved in the then process to solve the nuclear issue, namely the establishment of the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. So the whole KEDO process, in which the EU became one of the executive members and a particular important funding element of the KEDO project as well. Importantly for the EU, these activities were explicitly designated as a contribution to regional stability, meaning at that time the EU had a broader focus on strategic aspects already when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. And it wanted to play a more active role. And we can see this, of course, also in the context of Kim Dae-jung's then sunshine policies, which were one of the core elements, of course, why the EU also wanted to support this process, inter-Korean process as well, by engaging with North Korea more directly. There was a direct link between then President Kim Dae-jung and then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who had many bilateral consultations on this process, and Germany was one of the driving forces that most EU countries then established diplomatic relations to North Korea in the early 2000s. Then, of course, the second nuclear crisis in 2002 emerged, and this was when the EU relations to North Korea started to change from an active engagement approach to a more conditional engagement. While some of the initiatives were halted, humanitarian assistance continued, and the EU had established a political dialogue with North Korea, which also continued during that time. But the more active role of the EU then started to, let's say, become more conditional. And the EU basically focused on supporting the official six-party talks process without playing a direct diplomatic role in this process. And since 2013, we speak of a phase of development between the EU and North Korea, which we often call as active pressure. This was when North Korea started after Kim Jong-un assumed power, when North Korea started to re-engage with missile testing activities, nuclear testing activities. And this had the consequence that the EU focused very much on sanctions as its core strategic principle in dealing with North Korea. It halted the political dialogue. It halted diplomatic initiatives with North Korea, leaving basically only a couple of informal dialogue channels we had with North Korea in Europe, and of course the channels through the embassies. But this channel too then began to fade when North Korea went into a national lockdown in 2020 after the global COVID pandemic emerged, which had the consequence that the European Union member states closed their embassies in Pyongyang. And we see that so far only Sweden and Poland have resumed their diplomatic initiatives in North Korea, their embassies in North Korea, but they are still in a very early stage and haven't fully re-engaged with North Korea so far. So when North Korea then supported Russia's war against the Ukraine, of course, things changed dramatically in both Germany and Europe. We saw a direct result of the overlapping security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and Europe. And this, of course, brought many European countries, especially after North Korea deployed troops to an active war in Europe. This was when a lot of European countries then, of course, saw North Korea as a much more immediate threat. Plans to resume political dialogue between the EU and North Korea have been halted, therefore, and it's a very difficult situation now for Europe, because in the past we played this facilitator role many times, but this has become so difficult now that North Korea is actively involved in a war in Europe. Making it very hard for European countries under current circumstances to re-engage fully with North Korea, to propose a diplomatic initiatives, leaving Europe a little bit on the sidelines of events at the moment, of course. But within the EU, there is, of course, a debate on how to proceed with North Korea, and I'm happy that we can talk about this in the Q&A now as well. I would leave it at that at the moment and look forward for our engagement now.
Okay, thank you for your very, very succinct presentation on the German and the EU relationship between North Korea. Let's start with sanction. And then during your presentation, you mentioned that Germany and the EU in general, its perspective, it's pretty, changing on North Korea, but at the same time, their perspective on North Korean nuclear proliferation issue might not be changed. That's my first question. Is it really changing? Number two is, what about the reliability or effectiveness of a sanction? Does Germany and does the EU think that this sanction on North Korea regarding the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile development is still viable or not?
Let me start with the second question on sanctions. There are different motives and different rationales in a way linked to both UN and EU sanctions against North Korea. And of course, one of the objectives of sanctions was to change North Korean behavior, which ultimately did not happen. But there was always also another aspect to the sanctions, mainly to signal both to North Korea and to other countries that if you go down this route, we will sanction you whether you change your behavior ultimately or not. This is basically the aspect of sanctions which should increase the cost for North Korea to continue down its path, to make it more difficult. I don't think that anyone in Europe actually thinks that these sanctions will directly change North Korean behavior, but they will make it more costly for the North Koreans to further continue down this road. And I think this is what we have to differentiate when we think about the objective of those sanctions. It's also to signal to other countries that if you go down a similar path, of course, this will be both politically but also economically costly to you. So this is one of the aspects. Second aspect we have to mention here is that EU sanctions, of course, mainly consists, or the backbone of EU sanctions, of course, is the UN sanctions regime. But from the beginning, from the early stages in 2006 onwards, the EU sanctions regime actually went further than the UN sanctions, with additional listings of individuals, for example, with a broader sanctions on an earlier sanctions regime on delivering any kinds of weapons or dual-use goods to North Korea. So in the EU, Germany, France, and before Brexit, the UK have been the driving forces behind those sanctions regimes. And I actually don't see an end to it even now that the main, I would say, driver of sanctions now has moved outside the UN Security Council due to Russia and China basically openly breaking those sanctions resolutions now. And we see a multilateral sanctions team now that cannot, of course, replace what the UN did. But we see this strong effort also by Germany to continue and uphold the sanctions regime. And this is why Germany also deploys annually ships to the Indo-Pacific now. Part of their mission is to supervise that these sanctions, that the sanctions regime is implemented. So even though this is just an aspect of it, it became a core element also of Germany's and the EU's North Korea strategy, this whole sanctions issue. To your first question, if behavior actually changed, I would say over time the EU's behavior vis-a-vis North Korea changed quite dramatically from a really active player and providing opportunities for economic and political engagement with North Korea now to a very restrictive behavior, I would say, focused on sanctions first, without any, let's say, diplomatic initiative in the pipeline at the moment. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult for Europe, while North Korea is fighting in an active war in Europe, to start any diplomatic initiatives with North Korea now. But it's a good sign, I think, that first embassies reopened, because we need a credible information on North Korea, and ultimately we need to talk to North Korea too when we find the right framework. And maybe at the moment this right framework would primarily be more the unofficial level, so not starting a formal diplomatic initiative with North Korea, but maybe see if there is space for some informal communication channels now.
Okay. And let's talk about a little bit about Germany, and that's the follow-up question. The Russian aggression. Russia doesn't hide its intention to say expand its war beyond the Ukraine. Not just Moldova, Lithuania and then Poland and other countries feel very threatened, and then Germany is right behind it. Those buffer states is playing a role in the securing German and then French and then Italian or Spanish the security for a while. But as far as I understand, Germany actually started to de-arm itself, build up its military power all over again. Can you share your ideas, what's really going on in the German defense sector right now?
Yes, after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, our former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave a speech which was widely, of course, acknowledged because Germany has, due to its past, has been very, let's say, hands-off, had a hands-off approach to our defense industrial base. So the relationship between the government, mainly the Ministry of Defense, and the defense companies in Germany are very different than, say, in the Republic of Korea, where there is a much closer relation between the government and the defense industry. In South Korea, there's what we call an ever-warm production in the defense industry due to the ongoing conflict with North Korea. And in Germany, we had this very much an hands-off approach. And then after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the then Chancellor Scholz gave a speech which was entitled as Zeitenwende, so a change of times, basically a transformational change in a way, to the degree that Germany was in a different era, a new geopolitical era, and it had to react to it, meaning it had to rebuild, we have to rebuild our defense industrial base, which in the last decades, basically, since we were living in peace times, and we had not been investing in our defense industrial base as other countries. And this was rightly criticized also by the US in the past, not only by Donald Trump, but by his predecessors as well. And since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, all of this changed with a huge investment now in rebuilding our defense industrial base. With a more strategic communication between the government and the defense industries, and a more, let's say, a much more visible approach to our own security and defense. Not so much, of course, relying on other countries, even though other countries are inherently important, but also strengthening NATO as a whole. And Germany wants to contribute to the strengthening of NATO by investing massively now in its defense industrial base.
My last question before I let you go, let's go back to North Korea in the Ukraine. My last question is, how long will North Korean troops stay and fight against Europe and then Ukraine in Russia right now?
That is, of course, a very difficult question to answer. It really depends on the broader developments now of the war. Will we be successful in achieving any kind of at least stopping of the fighting? Will we achieve a peace agreement? This is all very, very far in the future at the moment. But I think North Korea is heavily invested in Russia's war against the Ukraine. And my argument would be that it's not only Putin now who has a direct stake in winning this war. It's also Kim Jong-un by now who invested heavily economically and politically. It was a big risk for him what he did there. And I guess if the price is right and we don't know exactly what the North Koreans actually get from Russia, for sending weapons, but also especially for the troop deployments. We are, of course, not 100% sure what they receive in turn, but if that what they receive from Russia is what they actually need at the moment, either technological know-how, if we think about re-entry technology of ICBMs, if this is what they actually get, I think they are even more invested to continue. So our challenge would be, how can we break up this close relationship between North Korea and Russia, at least once the fighting is over in the Ukraine? Because then, of course, the nature of Russia-North Korea relations will get into a new phase, and then it is we should ask the question: will it go on? Will this close relationship survive the fighting in the Ukraine, or will reality be new then for both countries?
Okay, so then according to your logic, and which I agree most, then North Korean troops and North Korean soldiers will be seen in the Europe at least for a while.
And I think so, even if we think about rebuilding efforts now, if Russia is successful in keeping some of the Ukraine's territory after the war ends, then of course it needs to be rebuilt, and North Korea could play the next role there.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for your excellent the answers to my tricky questions. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
오늘 내용의 핵심은 분명합니다. 유럽은 대화와 협력을 통해 북한에 대한 국제적인 사회화를 고수해온 오랜 방침을 철회하고 있다는 것입니다. 북한 문제는 더 이상 아시아의 문제가 아닌 유럽의 안보 현안이기도 하기 때문입니다. Now in North Korea 시즌2에서 스톡홀름의 안보발전정책연구원 자그나스 판다 박사도 북중러 관계의 강화와 권위주의 동맹이 인도의 안보에 위협이 될 수 있다는 점을 지적한 바 있습니다. 북한과 러시아의 안보동맹의 강화는 동아시아와 인도태평양 그리고 유럽 대서양의 지역적 질서를 흔드는 요인으로 작동합니다. 한국은 유럽과 안보 협력을 강화하면서도 북한과의 대화와 협력을 통해 한반도의 안정성을 어떻게 제고해야 할지 지역과 경계를 넘어 다각적으로 접근해야 할 시점입니다.